So in addition to being able to preview your before and after of any particular thing that you're doing in a panel, there's one additional type of preview called a clipping preview. And what do I mean by that? So when you're adjusting things like exposure or recovery or fill light using the sliders over here on the right, you often want to pay attention to when you're going to be losing detail either in the highlights or in the shadows. So let's take a look at this. If I turn on the highlight clipping preview, I'll do that by over here in the histogram. This is a graph of the tonal values in your particular image. There are two little widgets here in the upper right-hand corner and the upper left-hand corner. If I click on that little white icon there and hover over it, it tells me highlight clipping warning. And I can see there's actually a keyboard shortcut for that, the letter O. If I mouse over the black icon, it'll give me a tooltip telling me that's the shadow clipping warning. And I can see that the tooltip there shows me that the letter U is the shortcut for that. So I'm going to press the letter O. And you'll see this scary looking red overlay happening on your image here. And you're like, what the heck is that? Why is that a feature? What that's showing you is the areas in your image that are blowing out to completely white, where there's no detail in the image. And this is a nice visual aid here. It lets you figure out how far you're supposed to slide one of these sliders to get things back to being fixed. Or the opposite direction. If you start dragging in a direction, you start seeing red appear, you know that you should probably back off that particular adjustment. So let's see this in action. If I take the recovery slider and start dragging it to the right, you can see that all that red overlay, that warning blowout preview, is now gone because I don't have just solid white pixels in my image anymore, which is kind of cool. Let's turn on the shadow preview. I'll press the letter U to turn that on. And again, I can turn that on by clicking on the black icon there in the histogram as well. You can see I just have a little trace of shadow detail that's going solid black. You can see a little blue near her pants here. Let's really make this a little bit worse so you can see the blue showing up in detail here. If I move the exposure slider a little bit, or if I move the black slider, it's probably a better way to do it. If I make more of the image black, you'll see where in the image it's going to solid black and I'm losing detail in the shadows. So again, this is called the clipping previews or the clipping warnings. Red for blown out highlights, blue for too dark shadows. You can toggle them on and off by pressing the letter O and pressing the letter U respectively. So if you happen to open up an image and you forgot about and you see just a sea of red on your image, it's because that clipping preview is still on. You can just toggle it back off by pressing one of those keys. One of the things you want to pay attention to when you're opening up a RAW file and making some choices on it is this little hyperlink down here at the bottom. These are your output options. What your image will go out as when you either save the image or pass it over to Photoshop for further editing. If we go ahead and click on this hyperlink, it actually opens up the workflow options dialog where you can actually make several very important choices. First is which color profile you want attached to this image. Now by default, the profile that came in off the camera embedded in the image will be chosen, but you can also choose a different color space depending on what your workflow needs are. I'm going to keep this at Adobe RGB for now. The bit depth, that's whether it's 8-bit or 16-bit. Keep in mind that if you're going to be going to JPEG, JPEGs don't support 16-bit file formats, so you'll need to downsample that down or downbit it, if you will, to 8-bit. You can always make that choice in Photoshop later if you need to. You can do it there. It doesn't have to be done as part of the Camera Raw process, but you have that option here. This is the more important choice right now. This is the resampling option. If I click on this pop-up menu, you'll see that there's a middle value, and then there are some minus values and some plus values. So the middle value is the value that came in off the camera, what the resolution, the native resolution this file was captured at. So the camera captured essentially a 10 megapixel image. You can use Camera Raw to either downsample or upsample, and I highly recommend that you do that here if you are going to make your image larger or smaller, rather than passing it off to Photoshop and downsampling it there. Basically, because when you pass it over to Photoshop, you were already making a derivative of the digital negative, right? You're processing that file and passing it over to Photoshop. If you then up or downsample it in Photoshop, you're creating a second derivative. So it's always best to do that downsampling or upsampling from the native raw information that you have in the particular file. So you can set that option. You can also set the resolution setting for what you want your file to be generated at. 240 is a kind of an industry standard for inkjet printers. But of course, if you're going to create some images for the web, let's say, you might put in 72 or 96 and so forth. You have some options to pre-sharpen the image. Like if you're just going to be creating files that you will then print to your inkjet printer, you can do some global sharpening as part of the workflow options, which is kind of nice. When I go ahead and click OK, those settings are now remembered until you change them again. So every image I process with the Camera Raw file is going to be using these settings from then on. I can always go back and change it after the fact for the next set of images that I might be working on. So don't forget about this important blue hyperlink. You may need to change it from time to time depending on what your workflow options or needs are, and just wanted to point that out up front. One of my favorite things about the Camera Raw editor, in addition to being non-destructive, is that it's very easy to quickly see before and after of the adjustments that I might be making. I've got a preview checkbox here, but there is a little bit of a trick that I want to make sure you know up right away, because it might catch you later on. You might be scratching your head going, what's going on here? So preview is turned on by default. So whenever you make some choices in the panels over here, you're seeing the immediate effect of those choices. Let's go ahead and make some adjustments here just so we can kind of see what I'm talking about. I'm going to bring the exposure down a little bit just to darken the image overall. And I'll go ahead and do a recovery to bring out some of the highlight details. We'll open up the shadows with fill light a little bit. We'll set a dark point using the black slider and maybe increase the overall brightness and increase the contrast. And again, I'm just kind of eyeballing it as I move these sliders around. Maybe do a clarity to do a mid-tone contrast adjustment. Okay, so I've made quite a few changes here, and now I want to see before and after. I can either take my mouse and click on the preview checkbox to turn that on or off, but it's much easier just to press the letter P on my keyboard. So there's before and there's after. Now, if I want to preview the before and after of an individual slider, instead of everything that's been done in this panel, I just want to see before and after of one particular slider, then I wouldn't use the preview option. I would use the undo technique. So let's say I want to see the difference between a really high amount of clarity, so take that over to 93, or a really low amount of clarity. And I'll take it down to a negative direction. So now if I do Command or Control Z, it will toggle back and forth between those two values. So you can preview individual slider amounts as well, or the overall effect of everything in that panel by using the preview or the P key as well. Now, the preview functionality is per panel. So if I go over to hue saturation, let's say, and I click on the convert to grayscale button, now when I press the letter P, it is only previewing the before and after of the convert to grayscale. You can see I'm still seeing all the choices I made in that previous basic panel. So preview is isolated and local only to the current panel that you're in. If you want to see the overall preview of everything you've done to this particular image in this editing session compared to the way it started when you first opened, then you need to go to one of the panels on the end. That would be the presets panel. I'm going to go ahead and click on the presets panel. Now when I press the letter P, I get an entire before preview of what it's looked like before I even entered in the dialog here. And then I press P again, and it's now showing me the final result. So there is kind of a nuance there. Now there is kind of a keyboard shortcut that you can use to jump back and forth between a panel that gives you the full preview and any of the other panels. So Command Option Control Alt on Windows. If I press 1, that takes me back to the basic panel. Command Option or Control Alt 9 takes me to the presets panel. And as you might have guessed, these are actually numbered. So basic starts out with number 1, and then tone curve is number 2, detail is number 3. So I can do Command Option or Control Alt 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to go back and forth between those panels. Not anything you have to worry about right now. The one I want you to memorize is Command Option or Control Alt 1 and 9, because that's where you would want to jump back and forth to be able to do your global preview. So again, I did Command Option or Control Alt 9 to get to the presets panel. I pressed the letter P. There's my global before and after of everything I've done in this particular session. Just typing P to toggle back and forth. And then if I want to get back to the basic panel, Command Option or Control Alt 1. So there you have it, just a couple different tips on how to access and leverage all the non-destructive editing control that Camera Raw gives you, and able to preview either everything that you've done in a particular panel, preview before and after of individual sliders, or preview before and after of everything you've done by jumping over to that presets panel and then toggling your preview on and off. If you're watching this video, perhaps you've heard other people talking about shooting RAW and had little or no idea what they were talking about. In simplest terms, a RAW file is a digital negative. Like film negatives that came before them, you can develop multiple prints or versions from this digital negative, and each version can actually be dramatically different. Before we had the option to capture digital images in RAW format, we typically captured our photographs as JPEGs. Now, when you shoot in JPEG format, your camera is actually making a significant number of choices for you. Things like exposure, saturation, sharpness, etc. While you can certainly edit some of these choices in Photoshop, the amount of change you can make is going to be limited. Let's take a look at these two images to actually see what I'm talking about. You can see I've got both files are the exact same image, but one was captured as a JPEG and the other was captured as a RAW file. Now, if I were to double click on this JPEG file, Bridge would automatically pass that JPEG over to Photoshop, where you would then be able to edit it there. I actually want to edit this in something called Camera Raw. So a slight different distinction there. A RAW file is kind of a generic file format, and there's lots of different versions of RAW files. Each camera manufacturer kind of saves out their own version of a RAW file. So if you're shooting with a Canon, you might see the file extension at the end of your file names end in .cr2. Or if you're shooting with a Nikon, it might be .nef and so on. DNG is another common file format for RAW files. So here you see .dng, that's a RAW file. So rather than open up this JPEG in Photoshop, I'm going to click on it and then use the Open in Camera Raw button. And that will open up this file in the Camera Raw editor that's included inside Adobe Bridge. Now this image is obviously overexposed and it doesn't have a lot of detail in the highlights. In fact, with the camera settings used to capture this image, the camera did not capture any detail in the hair of the dog. So let's go ahead and zoom up here and you can see what I mean. There's just basically solid white. There are no details in that particular area of the image. Now I can try to use the recovery slider in Camera Raw to reveal detail in the highlights, but because this file was captured as JPEG, no additional detail was captured and included in the file for us to access. As you can see here, even though I moved that recovery slider all the way over to the right, basically the camera just saw a big area of white, didn't put any extra detail in the file for us to reveal. That's the simplest explanation there. It just doesn't include very much information in the JPEG file format. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. And instead, let's double click on the RAW file. Now, because it's a RAW file, when you double click on it in Bridge, it doesn't get opened in Photoshop directly because Photoshop doesn't actually know what to do with the RAW file. Instead, it automatically gets intercepted by the Camera Raw editor. So let's go ahead and double click. You'll see it opens up Camera Raw automatically. So you can see on the right, we still have those same sliders that we had when we were working with the JPEG file. And it may feel like you're editing this RAW file, but it turns out you're never actually editing the RAW files directly. RAW files are locked digital negatives. Instead, you're going to be making a series of choices of how you want this RAW file to be processed before you then go on to open it in Photoshop and eventually save it out as a JPEG or a Photoshop file or any other file format you might need to use. Let's take a look at the significant difference though. If I take that recovery slider all the way over to the right, you'll see magically hidden detail that wasn't there before is now appearing in the hair of the dog. And if I even take the exposure slider down and drag it to the left, you can see that file actually did contain a ton of extra information. You just didn't see it at first. So you've just learned the secret of a RAW file. A RAW file is not getting processed by the camera. It's not throwing away extra information. It's keeping all the information that the camera actually sees. Your initial view on that information, though, is whatever the settings you used in the camera. So obviously I didn't use the right exposure for capturing the dog. That's why it looked white initially. But the power of the Camera Raw editor here lets me have access to that hidden information. Let's go ahead and hit cancel. You'll learn a lot more about working with JPEGs and RAW files in the Camera Raw editor and see the power of that processing software. But in a nutshell, that's the big differences between JPEGs and RAW. Whenever you have the option, you typically want to shoot RAW, so you have the flexibility and the power to be able to make choices after the fact and take advantage of that extra rich information. If you have a low-end consumer camera that you're just carrying around in your pocket, you may only have the option to shoot JPEG. And then the more expensive cameras you buy have usually the option to shoot RAW as well. And when a pinch, if you want to have the flexibility of not having to process every RAW file and have JPEGs as well, a lot of cameras actually have the option to shoot both JPEG and RAW at the same time, which is what we used here to get these two different versions captured at the same moment in time, but one was saved out as a JPEG for quick editing and one was saved out as a RAW. So I'll just close with saying one disadvantage of RAW is because it is a digital negative, it has to be processed in order for you to be able to use it. So while you get more power and more flexibility, it actually does end up creating more work for you. So I'll only take a few minutes and talk about the benefits of the Camera Raw editor. I've already talked about the benefits of the RAW file format. This is a little bit different topic. This is the benefits of the software that is included in Adobe Bridge used to process RAW files. Now it can also be used to process other file formats, and I'll get to that in a moment. The first myth I want to dispel is that, Camera Raw is geeky. It's only for professional photographers. It's not for anyone who wants to make their images look better. And that's just false. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm starting with the Camera Raw editor in the Photoshop CS5 Essential Training title is because it is so powerful and so quick. It's actually a better idea to start in Camera Raw. Kind of the little phrase I use for new students or people new to Photoshop is to explain that you should be using Camera Raw for global changes and Photoshop for local changes. Now, what do I mean by global? By global, I'm talking about changes you're making to the overall image. So things like tonal correction and color correction and sharpening. If there are specific areas in an image that you want to adjust separately from the rest of the image, that's what I mean by local adjustments. And Photoshop is obviously the best tool for that. For global changes, though, the reasons why I like RAW is that it's a lot faster and easier to use than Photoshop in general. And I'll explain some of the benefits here in a moment. There's basically 5 reasons to start in Camera Raw before you open up the file in Photoshop for further editing. The first game changer here is that it's a non-destructive edit. Anything you do in Camera Raw is not actually affecting the file itself. What you're doing is making a series of choices. Those choices are being saved out as a little text file. Not to get too geeky, but it's called a sidecar file. And then when you open up that image again in the Camera Raw editor, it's simply loading those settings from that sidecar file into the dialog and presenting those updates to you. So you can make as many changes as you want. You never have to worry about destroying the file or doing something that you can't go back and undo because you're never actually editing the actual file. So that's benefit number 1. Benefit number 2 is that it has a built-in workflow. And what do I mean by that? So the great thing about Photoshop is that it's anything to everybody. I mean, lots of different people use the product. Doctors and creative professionals and designers and architects, even the FBI and law enforcement officials. Everyone kind of has a different way of using the product. And if you ask 10 different Photoshop experts how to do any particular thing in Photoshop, like how do you do a color correction, you'll probably get 10 different answers because it's that robust. What I love about Camera Raw is that the controls are laid out in the actual order that you're supposed to use them, at least until you learn the rules. And of course, you can go out of order anytime you want. But when you're just starting out, it's so much more approachable because it has a structured workflow. Now, if you go on to watch some of the other videos in this chapter, you'll actually see what I'm talking about instead of just listening to me babble about it. But hold that thought for now. There's a built-in workflow, and it takes the guesswork out of what you're supposed to do to get a good-looking image. The other thing, the number 3, is that it works on JPEGs too. So even though it's called Camera Raw, I actually wish Adobe would change the name of this thing because it's such a phenomenal little workflow, phenomenal little piece of software for editing JPEGs, RAW files, and TIFFs. And again, all non-destructively. So it's not just for RAW files. Number 4 is that it can be automated without recording Photoshop actions. For any of you who have actually tried to record actions before, you may have discovered that that's a potentially fragile workflow. Actions can get pretty complex pretty quickly, especially when you play them back on files after they've been recorded, or if you've inherited actions from someone else and for some reason you can't get them to work on your images. What I like about Camera Raw is that it's very easy to batch process dozens, even hundreds or thousands of images without a lot of effort or understanding. And then lastly, it's simply a better or quicker learning curve if you're just starting out. Now, if you have years of experience in Photoshop and you're just watching this title to kind of brush up on your skills or see what's new in the new version, you might have a different perspective on this. But I've been teaching people Photoshop for years, and even experts, when they see kind of this new workflow, they're like, wow, that is so much faster and so much easier. But what do I mean by this specifically? To get started in Photoshop, there's a lot of building blocks that you kind of have to roll up your sleeves and learn right away. You have to learn things like layers and how to make regional selections of a particular image or masks. You have to learn things like adjustment layers and things like curves and levels and blend modes, and it goes on and on and on. There are lots of little different building blocks. Now, all those building blocks add up to, the world's most powerful image editor on the planet. But when you're just starting out, you may just want to have a simpler learning curve, and Camera Raw represents just that. So that's a very quick overview. You're going to learn a lot more about the specifics and the power of these 5 points in the part 1 section of this title. But this is just kind of a way to get you thinking about why you might want to start in Camera Raw as opposed to just jumping in Photoshop and hunting and pecking around in the menus there. Okay, so the main value proposition of RAW files is that you have a bunch of extra information that you can manipulate and make your images look really great. And then the other benefit, of course, is it's always a non-destructive workflow, right? You're never actually changing the digital negative file on disk, which means you actually have to save out a variation or a copy of the file that you're processing. Now, most people think that you have to click the Open Image button in the Camera Raw dialog. That will then process this file based on the choices you've made over on the right in the panels. And then it will take that processed file and open it up in Photoshop, where then you can do some either further editing and then save it as a JPEG or a TIFF or a PSD or whatever file format that you might need. Now, here's the thing. If you're done with the file, like you have no intention of actually doing any further editing in Photoshop, you don't actually need to take the file in Photoshop to save out a copy. You can actually do that right from within Camera Raw without having to go over to Photoshop to do it. What you need to do is not look over here in the right-hand corner. You need to go over here and look in the left-hand corner at the bottom where you have this Save Image button. Before we get there though, let's just do a quick review. If you just changed your mind and didn't mean to do any of these edits, you were just experimenting, you of course can hit the cancel button and it just cancels all your edits as the name implies. If all you wanted to do was just update the settings for the file, you can click Done. That will take you back to Bridge and will modify the thumbnail to update your edits. Again, as discussed, if you hit the Open Image button, it'll pass the file over to Photoshop and create a copy of it for you. Little bonus tip, if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows, it actually changes what these buttons do. The cancel button becomes reset. So that's a way just to cancel but not leave Camera Raw because you just want to start over without having to reopen it from Bridge. And then let's talk about actually saving the image without going to Photoshop. Before you click the Save Image button, you want to make sure that your workflow options are set up the way you want. So for instance, if I wanted to create a low resolution JPEG version of this file, I'd click on the Adobe RGB button. I'd choose 8 bits per channel, maybe downsample this to a web resolution, so the smallest file size here. And I can type in a different resolution like 72 dpi and go ahead and sharpen for the screen, as in the monitor. Go ahead and click OK. That doesn't actually save the file. It just determines the settings that will be used when you click the Save Image button, which I'll go ahead and do now. I'll click Save Image. This brings up the Save Options dialog where you can determine where you want these files to be saved. I just have it set to my desktop. If you want a different location, you can go ahead and select Folder. You also have the ability just to save it in the same location as the raw file or file that you were editing to begin with. I typically create a separate folder though, and call it Processed or come up with some naming scheme that makes sense. For now, we're just going to save it to the desktop. You've actually got some built-in naming options as well. So if you want to come up with a naming sequence for your files, you can certainly do that. You can type in a base name right in this field, or you can just keep with the current document name where it's at. And then I can choose something like a 2-digit serial number. If I've got a series of these images that I'm saving out, I can basically create a custom naming scheme to apply to the entire series. Formats, I can actually choose JPEG, TIFF, or Photoshop right from the Camera Raw dialog here. I'm going to go ahead and choose JPEG. Digital negative is kind of an archival format. It will convert any raw file into this industry standard now digital negative format. I won't get into the details there, but it's a way to guarantee that a raw file will always be readable by the Camera Raw plugin, regardless of what raw file format it was originally. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and hit JPEG. You can, of course, choose your quality setting. I'm going to choose maximum. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And that's it. It's actually doing it in the background. You'll see real briefly, there was a 1 remaining little notice there. If you had several images selected, it would save all of them in the background. You can keep working while it's actually cranking those out. I can go ahead and hit cancel now. And if I switch over to my desktop and hide everything, you'll see there's the tour.jpg file that we just saved out from Camera Raw without actually having to take a side trip to Photoshop. Not necessary if you don't intend to do any further editing. You can just stop right there and save it right out of Camera Raw directly. Okay, here we are in the Camera Raw interface, the Camera Raw editor dialog. And let's take a brief tour of the elements that make up this editing piece of software. Again, you get to it by double-clicking on a raw file from Adobe Bridge, or by clicking on a JPEG file and doing Command or Control R to edit that in RAW or Camera Raw. So pretty basic at the top, you've got your toolbar. Instead of a vertical toolbar like you see in, say, Photoshop, these are arranged along horizontally. And, some pretty common tools. They all have keyboard shortcuts assigned to them as well. So if I want the hand tool, I can just press the letter H. If I want the eyedropper tool, I can press I. If I want the zoom tool, I can press Z. C for the crop tool, etc. If you don't know what a particular tool is, you can just, again, hover over the tool. It'll tell you the name of it and also tell you the shortcut that you can press to switch to that tool. One of the first things I do when I open up Camera Raw for the first time is I switch it into full screen mode because I find it confusing, especially for new users. This menu that you see at the top of your screen here, that's not the Camera Raw menu. That's the menu for Adobe Bridge. Camera Raw itself doesn't actually have any file menus. So I like to hide that by putting Camera Raw in the full screen mode. Now there's a button here in the upper strip here, toggle full screen mode. And just like in Photoshop, to go to full screen mode, you can press the letter F as well, F for full screen. And I just find that that maximizes the screen real estate for you. Now, I'm recording at a particularly low resolution here. So if you had a 30-inch cinema display, let's say, hitting that full screen would make the Camera Raw dialog take up the entire monitor. So again, you've got a lot of flexibility there to work it in a small dialog and resize it manually or switch it over to full screen mode. This is your editing area. It's also your preview area, one and the same. You've got a zoom switcher down here in the bottom left-hand corner. Over on the right, all your controls are laid out in panels. The default panel is the basic panel. And what I love about the basic panel is that the controls are laid out into a workflow. Basically, what I mean by that is they're laid out in the order that you're supposed to use them. Now, you can certainly go out of order and use them in any order you want, but when you're just starting out, it's actually comforting to know that, okay, the very first thing that you should do is set the white balance, right? So that's why that's listed first. After you set the white balance, then you want to get your exposure right. Is it too dark or too light overall? So you can dial that in. From there, you want to recover your highlight details if there's no details in the highlight. So here's a good example. With olive here has a little bit of a hot spot. There's probably more detail there that we can take advantage of. So let's begin by just lowering the exposure slightly to bring back the overall brightness down of the image. And then we'll take the recovery slider and drag it to the right, and you'll start seeing some details coming in those highlight areas, which is kind of nice. If I want to open up the shadows a little bit, the next slider down there is fill light. The black slider next is where you establish the darkest point in your image. The brightness slider is where you adjust the brightest part of your image. And again, they're just kind of laid out in the order you're supposed to do them. If you want to do an overall contrast adjustment, you have a contrast slider there. Clarity is a slider for doing a mid-tone tonal adjustment, so you can do mid-tone contrast. What's nice about clarity is that it doesn't change the darkest or lightest part of the image. It's only focusing on the midtones. Vibrance is a way to boost saturation or decrease saturation of colors that are already saturated. So if I go down, it's only affecting the most saturated colors. If I go to the right, it's only increasing colors that need additional saturation. And then the last slider here is an overall saturation slider for increasing global saturation, or actually making a very quick grayscale conversion. It's a nice little technique there as well. One little tip here, if you double click on any slider, it will reset back to its default value. So it's just a bit quicker than actually manually dragging that over. Down along the bottom are what we call the workflow options. So when I'm done editing this, I have some options here to either change my mind, cancel, hit done, be taken back to Bridge and update the thumbnail, pass that image on to Photoshop by clicking the Open Image button, or even saving this out as a separate file, skipping a trip to Photoshop altogether. In addition to the basic set of controls in the basic panel, we've also got a tone curve panel, and I can use this to do fine-tune adjustments to highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. We have a detail panel to the right of that. Go ahead and click on detail. And this is where we can do things like sharpening and noise reduction. The next panel over is hue saturation, where I can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminosity detail of each color individually in the image, which is kind of nice, gives you a lot of control. You can also do custom grayscale conversions in this panel by clicking the Convert to Grayscale button and then controlling each color independently on how it gets translated to black and white. The next panel over is called split toning. This is what you would use in conjunction with that Convert to Grayscale option in the previous panel and do things like create sepia tones or platinum tones and so forth. The next panel over is called lens corrections, and you can use this to fix vignetting effects. So if you have dark corners, you can eliminate those. Or if you've got some fringing along edges, you see like a cyan halo or a red halo, you can use this panel to quickly fix those issues. One more over to the right is the effects panel. Go ahead and click on that. This is where you can add things like digital film grain and do some vignetting. So you can add a black effect on the corners or a light effect on the corners to really frame the image a little bit, and that's kind of cool. The next panel over is the camera calibration panel. Now this is something that's a little bit more advanced. We may not cover it in the Essentials title, but I encourage you to check out Chris Orwig's Camera Raw title when you're ready to go really deep on Camera Raw. especially for a professional photographer. What this lets you do is build a profile for your camera. So if you find yourself doing the same adjustment over and over and over again, what you can do is you can teach the Camera Raw plugin to have a profile for your camera so that when you first bring your images in, it's more appropriate for the specific camera that you're using. And then lastly, there are two other panels for getting Camera Raw to be faster as a workflow for you. There's a presets panel. Right now it's currently empty, but you can actually save all these choices that you might make as individual presets that you can then apply to other images. And then lastly, on the right is something called snapshots. Snapshots are really cool. Again, it'll be blank here to begin with. But what snapshots let you do is create multiple versions of a raw file within the file itself. And then you can quickly go back and forth between them to view them. So lots of different options here. There's your quick tour. Of course, when you're done, you just click the done button and that takes you back to Bridge. And there you go.